In discussing the origins of Buddhism and Suzuki's work, I want to adopt a strategy similar to what he does, because his work is written for a Western audience. He is trying to make Zen intelligible for a Western audience. And in doing so, he's going to bring out many of the most difficult, the most different ideas for Westerners in Eastern thought. And so Zen is going to comprise something of a case study for us, because we don't have time to treat all of the different traditions in great detail. I think it will be the most helpful for us to deal with Zen for a variety of reasons. Zen is one of the portions of Asian religion that has become very popular in the United States and in the West generally. And this is something that's happened slowly over the last century. And we can speculate about the reasons for this, but the fact that it is popular is really not controversial. And so I take its popularity as a sign that it is something that resonates with a lot of people, and something that fits with the needs of a lot of people in the 20th and now 21st centuries. And so, that being the case, it's going to be useful for us to try and get at the foundations of what Zen is, and by doing so, also looking at the foundations of what Western thought is, and how it is that Western thought is typically different. In other words, by describing the challenges that we have in understanding Zen, not only will we come to understand a lot about Eastern thought generally, but we will very likely also come to a better understanding of Western thought and the peculiarities of the situation in the West for our time. And I take this to be, again, somewhat uncontroversial. Since the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century, I'm thinking of Marx and his successors, there has been a great deal of talk of a deep-seated problem in the West with respect to anxiety and alienation, something where we feel that the worldview that we have has an unacceptable gap in it, that there is a problem somewhere at the foundation of Western culture. And it's not always clear to us how we are to even talk about or to understand such a thing. And so following that train of thought, I think, will be useful, because it's there that Zen perhaps speaks most strongly to people. So let's at least consider that as a kind of working hypothesis for moving into this material. Now, a few words about Suzuki. Daisetz Suzuki is a more academic figure than what you're going to find in many of the popular writings that are intended to make Buddhism intelligible for a Western audience. And I chose Suzuki not only because of his more academic bent, but also because he still has a lot of the fire and a lot of the popularity, quite frankly, that a number of other authors have. Thich Nhat Hanh is one whom I think is particularly excellent. And then, of course, a number of the works that we have from the really talks, by and large, from the current Dalai Lama, those are also excellent. And they come from the same source, in the sense that you have someone who is very deeply embedded in that tradition and also very familiar with the West. And so it's possible then for them to really be in a good position to try and link the two and try and bring some of the Eastern material over to the West and make it intelligible to a Western audience. Suzuki is excellent with this, and he suits our needs a bit better, because he is not quite as casual and conversational and practical as someone like Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh is wonderful if you're interested in getting into Buddhist practice, and meditation in particular. And much of what the Dalai Lama has to say is excellent in this regard as well. And really, he is also, I dare say, more academic, but at the very least, certainly conversant with all of the detail that someone like Suzuki is going to bring in. In other words, I don't think that the Dalai Lama's writings lack any depth in any way. But they are more targeted to specific issues, anger, peace, happiness with respect to practicality and these sorts of things, what it is that a particular seeker might be wanting. Whereas Suzuki, although he is also writing for people who are similarly inclined, he's really more of a traditional introduction to the East, to Zen, in his approach. In other words, his is a bit more what we're accustomed to and appropriate for this class. So, that being said, let's get right into it. With Suzuki, we're dealing with Zen. Zen is an outgrowth of a fairly long history in Buddhism. Buddhism had already been around for a long time by the time we get Zen. And Zen is a Japanese inflection of Buddhism generally, but Chan and Kwan Buddhism in particular. Chan being Chinese, Kwan being Korean. And these are all Mahayana Buddhisms. And Mahayana Buddhism surfaced, say, 600, 700 years after the Buddha. So where the Buddha is around 600 BC, Mahayana Buddhism with Vimalakirti and others would have been around the time of Christ, around 100 AD, and then Zen in the centuries that follow, along with Tantra and all of the different flavors of Zen that we have. So, with that being said, one of the things that Suzuki is going to look to emphasize, which is going to be crucial for us to understand, is that personal experience is necessary for understanding Zen. And it's necessary in a way that is difficult for someone who's familiar with Western theology to grasp very easily. Because Zen is not dogmatic. It doesn't deal with gods at all. And it doesn't really have a theology in the same way. So you don't have any kind of core set of beliefs. So you don't have a bedrock of belief, faith, dogma, facts, truths of these kind that one can easily compare with the West. And I think Suzuki takes the right approach in emphasizing the experiential component of Zen, and in particular speaking of some of the bizarre stories that we get from Zen. And these are more than mere novelties. They illustrate what Zen is and really emphasize, I think they really underscore just how different it is from what we're accustomed to hearing about. So, for instance, when we hear about the Bodhidharma, this is in chapter 3. So the Bodhidharma, who was the first patriarch of Zen, was asked by Emperor Wu, what is the nature, the ultimate and holiest principle of Buddhism? And to which he replied, vast emptiness, nothing sacred. And this is a bit closer to doctrine than what we get in many cases with Zen. It's not quite as bizarre. But at the same time, it confronts us with a paradox straight away. And so, what is the holiest thing in Zen? The holiest thing that nothing is holy. The most sacred thing is that nothing is sacred. You see the contradiction here. And what is the ultimate principle in Zen? Vast emptiness. Well, emptiness isn't a principle. In fact, emptiness is the absence of principles, and it's something that is, it's not even just the negation of principles, it's the absence of the possibility of any principles, or anything for that matter. So, contained in the nugget of those words, vast emptiness, nothing sacred, is a lot of indicators of what Buddhism is and how it is that one thinks. So perhaps I should say that instead. Instead of saying what Buddhism is, we should say how one thinks in Buddhism, and how one can think about Buddhism. Because this implies more of a directly experiential role that one should have. So this is not merely a distillation of doctrine or truth or any kind of statements or claims that we're looking for, but instead it is to begin with at least, a way of thinking. So a change, a transformation in one's thought is certainly part of what is sought after, at least in the beginning. So I want to qualify this because I don't want to just characterize it in terms of a transformation of one's thinking. To do so risks being overly phenomenological, and we'll get to that as we talk about the phenomenologists and their approach to comparative religion, which arguably in this context would be overly reductive. Robert Casey Foreman actually argues specifically for this in his works, and really takes to task Stephen Katz and some of the others who have famously tried to argue for a phenomenological approach to religion and comparative religion. In other words, saying that everything, all experience is local to the individual and it's mediated by language and what we hear, the concepts that we hear. And so this is sort of a continuation of Freud in a certain respect, trying to characterize religion just as a certain kind of brain activity or a, certain kind of experience that's colored in very predictable ways by what it is that we hear, what it is that we're told we should be experiencing. And I think Foreman is quite right, and Suzuki makes a similar point in saying that this really isn't what's going on at all in the East in many cases. And Zen, I think, provides us with a particularly acute example of how it is that this is just not the case, because Zen doesn't try to give you the answer. In fact, the paradoxes that we see with the koans, the sound of one hand clapping, which is not this. The sound of one hand clapping is an explicit contradiction, as are so many of the other things. And even where it's not explicitly contradictory, it may seem to be just completely irrelevant, such as Joshu putting his sandals on his head to save Nansen's cat, which I believe is chapter 4. Suzuki discusses that example among a number of other famous examples. I mean, really, a lot of what Suzuki discusses are very famous examples in Zen. And if you read much more in Buddhism, then you're going to encounter these things over and over again. So the question really is, how are we to make sense? How are we to think about? How are we to even get started thinking about what it is that we hear in Zen? So with the example, however gruesome it might be, of Nansen's cat, which, by the way, let's not worry about being literal with any of these things, or even historical. Did Nansen actually kill the cat? This is really irrelevant for the purposes of this story, just the same as Schrodinger's cat might be, although his was clearly a thought experiment. So let's not worry about the historicity of these things. It doesn't matter if they actually mattered, if they actually happened. It doesn't matter if they actually happened. This isn't the concern in Buddhism, because Buddhism is pragmatic in this sense. What matters is the utility of these stories. One thing that Suzuki says that's of particular interest to us on page 35 is that the East tends to be synthetic, whereas the West likes particulars. And so this should be a kind of signpost for us for a more general idea, and this is something that's often suggested, that the way of thinking in the East is more communal, and it is something that tends to look at things all together rather than trying to take it apart and look at pieces in isolation. And so it understands relations of things more easily than it understands particulars. And to the extent to which this is true is not as important to us now, because the generalization is not really what's at issue here. The point is that this should direct us in a particular way thinking about the problem, in the sense that this may be a deep-seated, a foundational difference between the East and the West in terms of how it is that we deal with concepts, how it is that we are inclined to think about things. And our instinctive ways of thinking about things are really quite different. And at least with Zen and the West, the ways of thinking about things are clearly very different. Now, especially with someone who is rather developed in Zen, we see a very different approach to the world, really from anyone, including the East, so not just the West. But it's along these same lines. In other words, by trying to understand what's different about Eastern thinking as opposed to Western thinking, it involves us in a consideration of what kind of assumptions we might be bringing to the table and what kind of instincts we have in terms of trying to identify particulars and to really think in terms of the parts of speech and the things that the actions that we are accustomed to using. I'd like to do this by way of a story. I have a young son, and he's just 2 now, and he's still accustomed to saying, I don't like something, if he's presented with something he simply doesn't want to try, even if he has no idea what it is. It may be something that he's never encountered before, but he'll still say, I don't like it, which is interesting to us because I don't like it there doesn't mean I don't like it. He's not using the words in the same way that an adult would use them. He hasn't figured all of that out yet. So I don't like it is more of a way of vocalizing the visceral response of there's something about this that I don't like. So there's something about this experience that I'm not comfortable with. There's something about this thing that you apparently want me to associate with, whether it's broccoli or peas or whatever it is, that I don't like. That the words are being used differently is what's crucial there. And this is really a lot of what we're going to get in trying to understand Zen as well, because we have to put it in words that we are accustomed to hearing, because those are the only words that we know. In other words, it has to be translated into the language that we're accustomed to hearing. But the kind of thinking that is involved is not the same kind of thinking that we are accustomed to doing. And so just as with a toddler who has not fully been acculturated yet and has not fully learned to think like a Westerner, the particulars, the specificity of the way that each individual word is used is just not quite present. And so I would invite you to consider some of this with a lot of what you're going to read about the East and with Zen in particular, because many times the words are not being used in the way that we're accustomed to hearing them. In other words, the concepts are not components of claims. So we're not trying to string together concepts for the purposes of making a claim about something. And this is all too often the way that we think in terms of having each individual sentence that we construct being somehow translatable into a kind of mathematics of logic. In other words, what is it that you're really saying? Let me re-summarize this in terms of claims A, B, and C. And indeed, when people involve themselves in legal proceedings and whatnot, this is very much the language that's used, trying to be as clear as possible and as Western as possible with respect to what claims are we making, how precisely are we using certain concepts, and so on, which is one of the reasons perhaps that a lot of people in philosophy tend to be pretty good at law. Because it's very much the same kind of thinking. But what Suzuki is going to suggest to us, which is wonderful, is that this really doesn't help very much. That kind of thinking doesn't help very much when it comes to trying to understand Zen. And this is because the thinking itself is really very different. So anyway, all of this is to say, as we're looking at Zen, I want you to consider the possibility that the way that we are accustomed to thinking is not the only way of thinking. And their way of experiencing the world And what Zen is suggesting to us, that it is possible to experience the world in such a way that, putting sandals on one's head and walking out the door, is actually a deeply insightful way of handling a particular situation. It's not irrational. It's not crazy. It's simply very, very different than the way that we're accustomed to thinking about it. And so I hope you can curry a skepticism, just a healthy skepticism with respect to whether or not you understand what you're reading. In other words, whether or not it makes sense. It's important, I think, not to just react and say, oh, this is just nuts. I mean, this is crazy. It doesn't make any sense at all, to put your sandals on your head and walk out the door. What kind of answer is that? Well, precisely there, what kind of answer is it? It's not an answer in the way that we're accustomed to thinking about an answer, and that's the beginning of understanding what's going on.